Alright, what's up YouTube? It's time for a review of the new Panic! The Disco record, Death of a Bachelor. It's crazy to think that this is only album number 5 for them, because I feel like they've been around for so long. But maybe that's just because Panic really came into the spotlight when I was just getting to music in early middle school. In reality, you do the math, and they've put out about an album every 2.5 years. Up to this point, the band's discography is certainly commendable, if not for the sole reason that each record really stands alone as a singular statement. And looking back, you can really place all the credit for that on the sophomore album, Pretty Odd. Because when a band really hits it out of the park with a debut album, like Fever, You Can't Sweat Out, and have numerous hit singles, there's a lot of pressure to follow it up, and in a lot of cases, bands will take whatever formula worked for album 1, just put out a watered-down version of it for album number 2. But with Pretty Odd, they gave people an enormous left turn. And with an album like that, aside from the hit single 9 in the Afternoon, listeners now knew never to expect the same record twice, which is a really liberating thing for a major band like Panic! Me, personally, looking back, I loved Fever. I was in early middle school when that came out. I loved the hits and later got into some of the deeper cuts. I think Fever is still a great record, even over 10 years later. Whatever style you want to call it, pop punk, there's emo influences on it, whatever you want to call it, it's a really great record. It's really, nothing sounds like it when you look back at the time. It kind of sounds like this weird mix of, like, it drew from the My Chemical Romance fan base, it drew from more the pop punk fan base, and it's the kind of album that would have fit in on the Z100 Jingle Ball stage and on Warped Tour, which is very cool. Pretty Odd, there's some hits and some misses on that record, but I'm someone who absolutely loves when bands change it up, so I absolutely support that album. I think there's some really, really great songs. Special shout out to She Had the World, which is so Beatles, and I just love it. For me, though, it all came together on the third album, Vices and Virtues, which to this day remains one of my favorite all-time LPs under the alternative umbrella. Needless to say, after Vices, it was going to be very tough to follow that up, at least for me as a fan. And Too Weird to Live, Too Rare to Die, I actually actively disliked when it came out. Of course, hindsight's 2020, and I actually saw Panic! This past September in Boston, and they really brought a lot of those tunes to life, just seeing them in a live environment. Songs like Nicotine and This Is Gospel. So I've kind of reneged on that. Maybe I wasn't ready for that change at the time. But here we are, album number 5, Death of a Bachelor. As is commonplace now, it's basically industry standard. Half the album was out before it actually came out last Friday. In case you guys are at all curious as to what my initial thoughts were on those singles, I'll link down in the description a blog post I did about the singles leading up to Death of a Bachelor. Depending on how you look at it, there were either 5 or there were 6 because they also released the title track, although it wasn't on the streaming version of the album on iTunes. I mean, when you think about it, Hallelujah was released last summer, so it's actually been a relatively slow ramp up to Death of a Bachelor. But here we are. 37 minutes, 11 tracks. Thank fucking God. I can't stress this enough. There's very few artists that have 70 minutes worth of must-listen things to say musically. We can, of course, think of exceptions. But generally, with 11 tracks, it gives each song really room to breathe and stand on its own. When you think of the 11 tracks here on Death of a Bachelor, something very specific comes to mind for each one because nothing becomes interchangeable. A lot of the filler is cut out. So the other advantage is when reviewing it, we can go track by track and have plenty of time to really get into each one. So without further ado, let's get into each track. We begin with Victorious, a track that is just brimming with energy. I gotta say, right out of the gate, I am hearing, if I've ever heard one, I am hearing a future live staple. You combine the anthemic chorus with that stomp of the post-chorus section, that synth riff that's just crushing. You can really see seas of people jumping up and down to this one, singing it, which a lot of the tracks on here, I should mention, do go for that anthemic status. Not all of them reach it, but Victorious definitely does. Special shout out lyrically to the phrase living like a wash-up celebrity, which really stuck with me after a few listens. It's one of my favorite lyrics on this whole LP. With track 2, Don't Threaten Me With a Good Time, we start treading a little bit of indie ground here with that silly little guitar riff that comes in and out, alternating with the descending piano line in the verses. What's interesting about this track is that it feels a little empty and spacious, but that's because when you think about it, it sits in the track listing between Victorious and Hallelujah, 2 explosive songs. So even though it kind of, at first, it left a little bit to be desired for me, you see the complete vision when you hear all 3 tracks in a row. And let's be honest, champagne, cocaine, gasoline, that's great. I mean, for me, Jack and Coke's, usually do it, maybe a couple Xanax pills, but like, he's having a party. You know, this is a Vegas-themed album. Why not? Champagne, cocaine, gasoline. It's great. Another successfully done anthemic hook for sure. This could be another one that would thrive in the live environment. Which actually segues perfectly into track 3 on Death of a Bachelor, Hallelujah, a track that initially I just didn't like. It felt to me kind of like this half-hearted attempt at a crowd sing-along song, like almost tailor-made for that. But then I saw Panic in September, and they played this tune, and I saw it with a crowd, and it clicked for me. There's a reason. It's okay to make songs that are tailor-made for an audience. That being said, Hallelujah, in terms of, if we're comparing this, because as a band, you're mostly compared to your past work. And in terms of singles, Hallelujah still is a little lightweight compared to stuff like I Write Sins Not Tragedies at 9 in the afternoon. So it fits well in the flow of the album, but it is not the best lead single from a Panic album that we've heard. Ember's New Clothes, the next track, is definitely the most aggressive cut on the entire album. It's sprinkled with these colorful electronic flourishes, but the chorus is very dramatic and very in your face. And in the verses, contrarily, we get Brendon Urie kind of splashing around in the lower end of his vocal range, which is a great change of pace. And I don't know what the fuck those lyrics are. Finders, keepers, losers, weepers. I'm all dressed up and naked, I think is one of the lines. I haven't really read the liner notes, but the thing about pop and rock and alternative is a lot of times lyricists get a pass if the melody is there. Some genres, like I would argue country, and I would argue to an extent hip hop, you really have to process what the words are saying and what they mean to you, what they mean to the artist, what they mean about the world around us. But what you're going to remember about a track like Ember's New Clothes is the melody and the words that fit to it, but not necessarily what they mean. But I like the goofy vibe on a lot of these tracks, but thank God for the next one, the title cut, Death of a Bachelor, which boasts by far the album's best lyrical content. It's really saying something. Look, Champagne, Cocaine, and Gasoline is fun, but I really enjoy, like, this is a really heartfelt, interesting tune. It brings the energy down after pretty much 4 in-your-face alt-rock, pop, whatever you want to call them, really in-your-face tracks. They got these jazzy, chromatic horns that give it this really nice vibe, really smooth. And so by this point, we're almost at the halfway point. You know, something I loved about Vices and Virtues was that each track was very individual. It stood on its own, and it had its own vibe in some way, whether it was sonically, or the groove, or the melody, or the instrumentation. And 5 tracks in, Death of a Bachelor is doing the same thing. It's really great to see none of the songs being interchangeable or being carbon copies of another, which is valuable even if you don't like some of the tunes. Like, for example, this next track, Crazy Equals Genius, I don't like. It just doesn't appeal to me. It's got the most hyper energy of anything on this track, but the lyrics don't do it for me. Yeah, if Crazy Equals Genius, I'm an arsonist. It's funny, it's cute, but the track isn't really there. It's probably one of the weaker songs on here, but at least there's variation. It's very hard to complain when a band is able to vary things. When something misses because it's different and you're not into it, is very different than when something misses and it's just a shittier version of what's already there. On a more positive note, the next track, LA Devotee, is by far one of the highlights of the album for me. A pop-punk influence on a Panic at the Disco song hasn't been this prominent in a long time, possibly since A Fever You Can't Sweat Out. This is the track that I did not see coming on this album, and it really thrives with one of the best choruses on the album. Definitely sits in the top tier of choruses, and I know this is a minor thing for a lot of listeners, but what a bass fill into that final chorus. Listen for that bass fill. Put on your sub, crank up if you have any EQ, crank it up and listen for that bass fill, because it actually makes the song. That explosion into the last chorus is really what makes it. Speaking of final choruses, we have possibly my favorite musical moment on this album, the final chorus of Golden Days, the next track. This is another high point for me. This is another success. The rhythm in the beginning almost has like a vibe of like the Starfucker album Jupiter. It almost has that vibe, and it has this bounce with the guitars coming in and out, which gives it a great texture. It's yet another different rhythm. We go from Crazy Equals Genius to LA Devotee to Golden Days, and that's what's one of my favorite things about Panic. What makes them one of the most interesting alternative bands, whatever direction they go in, is we have so many different vibes in such a short period of time. Golden Days, that dramatic chorus is very, very Vices, so obviously it appealed to me. I can see how someone would think it's repetitive, but to me it's one of the tracks that works better on this record. Following those two peaks, unfortunately we had another valley here with The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. By far my least favorite track on this record, mostly because it doesn't say anything musically that isn't already present on Death of a Bachelor. It sounds really like a leftover from any other Panic at the Disco record, which, given all the praises I've sung about this band for being so unique and trying so many different things, that is not a good thing. That is not something you want on a Panic record. It really sounds like it's from the cutting room floor. Now, the chorus is catchy and enjoyable, but it's just very bland. There's nothing there that's memorable to the point where it's, luckily, the only skippable song on Death of a Bachelor, but it is the one that I've tended to skip after hearing it 3 or 4 times, because it doesn't have anything redeeming that I don't get from any other Panic at the Disco song. This closing 1-2 punch of House of Memories and Impossible Year is interesting because House of Memories is the only tune on here that I could describe as medium paced. It's a very mild track. Not saying that it's bad, it's just a mild track, and it brings things down gradually into a closing ballad in Impossible Year, which I thought was an interesting strategy. When I heard the beginning of House of Memories, I was just like, more whoa-ohs. The whoa-oh thing gets so played out so quickly, but in this case, it's more catchy than Good, Bad, and the Ugly. So it functions, it serves its purpose, and it segues into a really lovely closing ballad in Impossible Year. Another lyrical highlight. The 2 ballads on here, if you want to call Death of a Bachelor a ballad, are really where the album gets a little more tender, a little more personal. Plus, I mean, the way the horns come in after the second chorus of Impossible Year is just a lovely, lovely way to send this album off. It feels very classy. And it's interesting because when I got to track 11, I was like, yeah, this album does need a ballad. It feels about right. And Impossible Year functions more like a flat line, like a nice, I'm going to relate again to Vices maybe because that's my favorite record, but a lot like Always. There's no peaks and valleys in Always. It's just a nice ballad that fits amongst a bunch of high energy tracks on an album, and that's very much what Impossible Year does. This time just sending the album off with a ballad. Very Aerosmith style. I always used to love how those Aerosmith records, when I was first getting into Aerosmith, they all ended with like a really nice ballad, and that's what Panic does here. And that horn section sending everything off is a great way to finish everything out. Here's the thing about Death of a Bachelor. It's an album that hypothetically could be played from beginning to end in a live concert environment and would really work. And that's one of the major signs of an album that feels complete. It's an album that feels done. It's got a really well-calculated pace that ebbs and flows throughout these 11 tracks, bringing it from hyper manic energy to mid-tempo songs to a couple ballads, a couple more rock-oriented songs. And that's one of the things that, even if every track is not a home run for me personally, it feels done. It doesn't feel like there's anything left unsaid. Sonically speaking, it's actually the most similar inter-album transition that Panic at the Disco has had between Too Weird to Live, Too Weird to Die, and Death of the Bachelor. And I'm not at all suggesting that the musical content is necessarily similar, but for the first time, it actually feels like a logical follow-up. And I'm not saying that Pretty Odd being an illogical follow-up is a bad thing, but it does feel like the album that would come next after Too Weird. To me, though, it's a much better album. It's a much more muscular album musically. There are 2 tracks that I blatantly dislike, which are Crazy Equals Genius and The Good, the Bad, and the Dirty, but meanwhile, there are 4 tracks that I very specifically love, which are Victorious, the title track, Golden Days, and LA Devotee. I mean, whether you're a fan of Panic's music or not, it's hard to deny that Brendon Urie is a wildly talented musician. For me, this album sits number 3 in the band's discography. You know, we're only a handful of listens in, so time will tell. But it is certainly a better record than Pretty Odd, and it's certainly a better record than Too Weird to Live, Too Rare to Die. But if you're a fan of this band, if you're a fan of hooky music, you will enjoy Death of a Bachelor. That is guaranteed. It's a good album with a couple of tunes that could have gone a different way for me, but overall I'm very pleased with it. It's another great installment in Panic at the Disco's discography.